Haha, it looks fine and it looks beautiful. Could use some lights though. Hi guys, I hope you're all doing well today. So what I want to do today is do a graphics comparison of my current video card, which is a GTX 1070 Founders Edition from MSI, with my new RTX 3080 Ventus from MSI. If you want to see this puppy live in action, don't hesitate to visit twitch.tv/archfamily, link in the description below, and don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when I'm going live, so you can watch this video card destroy games like the beast it is. Also, don't forget to check out the About Me section. Now, without further ado, let's see how these cards compare. So the games we'll be comparing today have been set to the absolute extreme ultra, and they are World of Warcraft Retail, Battlefield 5, and Star Wars Battlefront 2. Mainly because those are the only games I currently own and can record that have super high graphic settings. Until I figure out how Bandicam works, because it has problems with easy anti-cheat. Anyway, so let's start with World of Warcraft and we'll build up from there. So I'm just flying about in Borealis Harbor in Battle for Azeroth with all graphics maxed, as you can see, and I'm finding an averages between 55 and 65 FPS. Now, I have to say this was recorded in the morning time, so it's not particularly busy, but as far as graphics go, it's rendering all the necessary graphics quite far due to the maxed out draw distance. So even though in dungeons the draw distance is much less far, the FPS actually went down to about an average of 50, mainly due to all the visual effects happening at the same time in a close area. So that's what it was on the GTX 1070. Let's see how this actually looks with the RTX 3080. So as you immediately can see, just with flying around in the same area, Borealis Harbor, the average FPS goes from around a minimum of 75, which is already 20 FPS higher than the GTX 1070, all the way up to 121 FPS while testing the draw distance difference. So on average, the RTX 3080 performs better, with an average increase of at least 20 FPS all the way up to a maximum of an almost 60 FPS improvement. That's crazy even for a game like World of Warcraft, which isn't necessarily made for a graphics display. Now let's see how this works in Battlefield 5. So just like with World of Warcraft, all the settings for Battlefield 5 are set to the absolute extreme, except motion blur because that's a stupid feature. I do have to say that Battlefield 5 is one of those games that draws immensely from the CPU and isn't balanced that well. And I am using an Intel i5 9600K, which is actually set to overclock and runs at a consistent speed of 4.3 GHz. And Battlefield 5 actually manages to use 100% of it. It stays at about 55 degrees Celsius, so it's actually fine. Now, right from the start though, we see that in Battlefield 5 there are some spikes happening at times where the FPS drops significantly from between 90 and 70 FPS average to as low as 25 just for a second, and then it gets back up to about that previous range. Now, if you were a competitive FPS player, these settings are definitely not what you want. And yes, I am aware that competitive FPS players don't usually play with the graphics settings set to the ultimate extreme, nor do I usually play with these high settings, but if you're going for looks and gameplay, well then even with the super ultra settings you would probably get annoyed by the spikes. So as a verdict, if you count the spikes happening, which are quite hard to look around, you are averaging between 25 and 90 FPS depending on your location, i.e. are you in direct and busy combat or just lying around in the bushes from 2 kilometers away to get that perfect, satisfying headshot. Now let's see how the RTX 3080 does with the same settings. So as you can see, I was able to turn up the graphics even more with DirectX 12 enabled, DXR enabled, and high dynamic range on auto, even though I don't actually use a 4K monitor, but it's a high graphics setting, so why not test it? I also put the frame rate limiter up to 200, which is the absolute maximum. Now I'm not sure why I couldn't enable NVIDIA DLSS, but then again, as I said before, Battlefield 5 isn't a very well balanced game, which will become more clear in just a second. Like I said, due to the game not being balanced quite well, even though it looks beautiful, the frame rates jump all over the page, with getting as low as 11 and going as high as 76. So even with less things to render over a distance, with the close combat and the higher graphic settings, we actually get an average of 15 less frames per second in BF5. Now, this could be due to the fact that BF5 draws a hell of a lot of power from a CPU, and even though my CPU isn't the worst, it's not the best as well. It's an i5 9600K, like I said before. Getting back to the being unbalanced argument, so we're just going to leave it with the following verdict: I need a new CPU. Now to get to the finale. When I first played Star Wars Battlefront 2 in the single player, I was amazed with how good it looked and actually how it played as well. The multiplayer went fine as well, so the game is definitely better balanced than Battlefield 5. But how does it translate into FPS with the highest possible graphics settings? As you can see, while flying with quite a far off draw distance and everything at ultra, the game looks, well, absolutely beautiful to be honest, which makes me even more excited to show you how it looks on the RTX 3080 with ray tracing and other cool stuff enabled. So in flight, the game is actually running between 110 and 140 FPS on the GTX 1070, which is pretty much the maximum I can get with my monitor, which is a Full HD 1ms 144Hz refresh rate monitor from ASUS, and with these games, well, you can't really tell the difference with those high FPS amounts anyway. For the RTX 3080 though, I will be trying to get above 144Hz just because I can. So, verdict though. The GTX 1070 actually performs very well, although it was recorded during a flight which is less taxing than actual close combat, which we will be trying with the RTX 3080 and see how it compares. Now, right from the get-go, the FPS counter actually goes up to 200 frames per second, which is insane. It is a starting, of course, with not a lot of going on. Further on, with multiple lasers going around and shields being generated, it still averages between 140 and 180 frames per second. There were a couple small spikes, as you'll see, but most were not as bad as in Battlefield 5. If you'd really want to play this game well, and pretty much every first-person shooter well, you wouldn't turn up the graphics that far anyway, and these are points where CPU usage is also important, and mine isn't the best like I said before, but not far off to be honest. Even at the end, with Palpatine's lightning flying around, lasers, multiple people, etc., the frame rates are still averaging of about 130 frames per second, which is very good. This was obviously much more taxing than the flying we saw with the GTX 1070, and it still outperformed with between the 10 to 40 FPS improvement. So in conclusion, in case it wasn't exactly clear and probably to no one's surprise, the RTX 3080 performs much better than the GTX 1070 in the games that mattered, and were balanced the best, with an average increase of between 10 and 60 frames per second, depending on the zone and what's going on, of course. Bear in mind that you can tweak the performance even more if you use MSI's Afterburner software and or MSI's Dragon Center, which you can both use real time. So that was today's video, guys. If you want to see more of this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe and click the little bell to be notified when the next video is coming up. Also, if you have suggestions, please put them in the comments below so I can read it and apply it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.